welcome to The Historian Translated. Please like and subscribe. Without further ado, let's begin.
Welcome back to our channel, and welcome back to our chronological Crusade series. While the more famous Middle Eastern Crusades raged on, a battle for Europe was brewing. This is a new chapter in our Crusade series, deserving of its own series. This is the Baltic Crusade. The Baltic Crusade begins, the papal call of 1193 and the pagan resistance. In the year of our Lord 1193, as warriors clashed for the Holy Land, Pope Celestine III turned his gaze elsewhere, to the distant untamed north. There, in the frozen forests of Livonia, Prussia, and Lithuania, the fire of paganism still burned strong. Unlike the Muslim empires of the Middle East, these tribes had never known Christ, never bowed before his cross. With a stroke of his quill and a seal of wax, Celestine proclaimed a new crusade, not against Saracens, but against the last pagans of Europe. The Pope's Call and the First Crusaders. The call to arms spread across the Holy Roman Empire and Denmark, reaching the ears of land-hungry nobles and pious knights. Unlike the Crusades to Jerusalem, this war was close to home. And unlike the walls of Acre or Damascus, these pagan lands lay rich and unfortified, theirs for the taking. Among those who answered was Bishop Berthold of Hanover, a priest-turned-crusader. Named the new bishop of Livonia, he swore to bring Christ to the Baltic, by the sword if necessary. The arrival of the Crusaders. In 1195, the first Crusaders arrived on the shores of Livonia, modern Latvia. They came in mail and surcoats, bearing the cross, expecting to meet enemies like those of the Holy Land, ranked armies with banners and fortresses. But the Livonians, Prussians, and Lithuanians were no ordinary foes. They fought not for kings or empires, but for their gods, their forests, and their ancestors, how the pagans lived and communicated. The tribes of the Baltic spoke ancient tongues, unintelligible to the Crusaders. Livonians, Prussians, Lithuanians, and Estonians each had their own dialects, their own oral traditions. There were no books, no written laws, only the words of elders passed from one generation to the next. They worshipped Perkunus, god of thunder, and Velnius, lord of the underworld. To them, the forests, rivers, and stones held spirits, watching, protecting. The arrival of armored men with their iron-clad god was an offense against nature itself. At first, the pagans met the Crusaders with caution, not steel. They had seen Christian traders before, Danes, Germans, Novgorodians. Some chiefs considered baptism as a means of survival, a way to secure peace without war. But others saw through the deception. A baptized chieftain was a servant to foreign lords. The first battles, pagan resistance begins. In 1196, the first true battle began. Bishop Berthold, seeking to assert his rule, ordered his crusaders to march inland, burning shrines, smashing idols, and baptizing villages by force. The Livonians had no stone castles, no walled cities, but they had the land. They fought as ghosts in the trees, striking from the shadows, then vanishing before the Crusaders could retaliate. Arrows rained from the canopy, and hunters became warriors. When captured, the Livonians refused to renounce their gods. They mocked the Crusaders, calling them slaves to a foreign king. Some even spat at the cross, daring the priests to kill them. The death of Berthold and the turning point. In 1198, Bishop Berthold led his men into battle near the Daugava River. He believed he could break the Livonians with a single decisive victory. But the Livonians had no need for siege towers or open field charges. They lured the Crusaders into dense marshes where their heavy armor became a curse. As the knights struggled through the mud, the Livonians surrounded them, striking like wolves. The bishop was slain, his army shattered. What was meant to be a holy conquest had become a disaster. But the Crusaders would not retreat for long. In Rome, a new pope sat upon the throne, one far more determined than Celestine. His name was Innocent III, and he would not let Christendom fail. The second wave, Pope Innocent III and the rise of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, 1199-1202. The year is 1199. In the east, Crusaders lay siege to Muslim strongholds. In the west, kings battle for thrones. But in the north, The war for the soul of Europe is just beginning. The pagan tribes of the Baltic have shattered the first wave of crusaders, slaughtering the Bishop of Livonia and routing his forces. Many in Christendom see this land as cursed, a graveyard for holy men. But Pope Innocent III sees something else, an opportunity, and he will not be denied. Pope Innocent III's crusading vision. Innocent III is unlike any pope before him, young, ambitious, and utterly convinced that his authority is absolute. Where others have failed, he will succeed. He believes that the pagan tribes of Livonia, Estonia, Prussia, and Lithuania are an insult to Christendom. If they will not convert, they will be crushed. Innocent's decree spreads through the Holy Roman Empire and Denmark, calling for a renewed crusade. But this time, he knows he needs more than just soldiers. He needs an order of warrior monks, men bound by faith and discipline, who will fight not for gold, but for God. The birth of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, 1202. In 1202, the Pope's vision takes form. With his blessing, Bishop Albert of Buxhoven, a German noble and cleric, arrives in Livonia with a new plan. He founds an elite military order, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword. Who were the Livonian Brothers of the Sword? They are not mercenaries. They are not knights seeking glory in the Holy Land. They are monks and warriors in one, their lives dedicated to prayer, discipline, and war. Their appearance, dressed in white cloaks emblazoned with a red sword cross, they resemble the Templars, but their cause is entirely northern. Their rules, they live by the Cistercian monastic code, vowing poverty, chastity, and obedience, but they wield the sword just as much as the Bible. Their purpose, to Christianize the Baltic by force, ensuring that no pagan tribe remains unconverted. But to the Livonians, these were no missionaries. They were an army, and where they rode, fire followed. The conquest of Riga 1202-1203. Unlike past crusaders who launched brief raids, the Brothers of the Sword came to stay. Their first goal? A permanent Christian stronghold in the heart of pagan lands. They fortified Riga, turning it from a vulnerable outpost into an armed city, a symbol of Christian power in Livonia. And from this stronghold, they would begin their holy war. How the Livonians resisted. The Livonians, outnumbered and out-armored, did not surrender. They fought back with everything they had. Guerrilla tactics, they refused open battle. Instead, they ambushed crusader patrols, striking from the trees and fading into the mist. Hit-and-run raids, rather than defend their villages, they burned them themselves, leaving nothing for the invaders. Psychological warfare, they sent severed crusader heads back to Riga, a warning to the invaders. They were not merely warriors, they were defenders of an ancient way of life, and for every victory the Brothers of the Sword won, another storm brewed on the horizon. The next phase, the war spreads, 1203, 1206. By 1203, the war had expanded beyond Livonia. The Estonians rose against the Crusaders, uniting under powerful warlords. The Lithuanians, still untouched by Christian armies, began launching their own raids. The Prussians, another pagan group, resisted conversion with equal ferocity. The Livonian Brothers of the Sword had begun their conquest, but they had underestimated the strength of the old gods. And the war was only beginning. The Livonian War, 1206-1227, and the Estonian Uprising of 1217. The year is 1206. The frozen north is about to erupt into flames. For decades, the Crusaders have been waging holy war in the Baltic frontier, but the pagans of Livonia, Estonia, and beyond refuse to kneel. Now the stage is set for a brutal 2-decade-long war, one that will test both Christian knights and Baltic pagans to their very limits. This is the Livonian War of 1206 to 1227, a war of faith, fire, and unrelenting resistance. But first, we must understand how it all began. Chapter 1. The Invasion of 1206, Denmark's First Strike. Our story begins in 1206 with an ambitious king, Valdemar II of Denmark. The Danes had been raiding the Baltic coastline for years, but this time Valdemar had something far greater in mind, permanent conquest. His fleet, filled with knights, warriors, and priests, landed on the shores of Saaremaa, a large Estonian island known for its fierce raiders. The Danish king's goal was clear: establish a Christian foothold in Estonia before the German Crusaders did. But the Estonian tribes were not about to let foreigners rule their land. The Saaremaa warriors, expert seafarers and raiders, fought back ferociously. Though the Danes established a fortress, it was short-lived. As soon as Valdemar's fleet left, the Estonians burned it to the ground. The first invasion had failed. Chapter 2: The Livonian Brothers of the Sword and the Christian Expansion, 1207. While the Danes struggled, the Germans pressed forward. In 1202, the militant order known as the Livonian Brothers of the Sword had been founded, combining monastic discipline with brutal military conquest. Led by Bishop Albert of Riga, they aimed to convert the Baltic through force. By 1207, they declared Livonia a Christian state, though in reality the land was still fiercely contested. Over the next 4 years, the Brothers of the Sword waged a war of terror, forcing villages to convert, killing those who resisted, and building fortresses to cement their rule. But every time the Crusaders thought they had won, the Livonians and Estonians rose up again. The Christian grip on the land was far from secure. Chapter 3: The Estonian Counterattack, 1211-1216. The Estonians had had enough. In 1211, they launched a coordinated counterattack, burning Christian strongholds and ambushing Crusader patrols. Their raids were swift and devastating. No Crusader stronghold was safe. In response, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword retaliated with a campaign of extermination, seeking to crush Estonian resistance. But for every battle they won, another uprising followed. The war was turning into a grinding, relentless conflict. Chapter 4, 1217, The Estonian Uprising and the Battle of St. Matthew's Day. In 1217, the Estonians united like never before. Under the leadership of Lembitu of Lehola, an Estonian warlord, the tribes of Estonia joined forces in a desperate bid to drive out the Crusaders. This was no mere raid, this was an all-out war. Lembitu raised a massive army and began reclaiming Estonian land. The Crusaders could not ignore this threat. A great battle was coming. On September 21st, 1217, the two forces met at the Battle of St. Matthew's Day. The Livonian Brothers of the Sword, led by Volkwin of Naumburg, marched against the Estonians. But they did not come alone. The Danes had returned. King Valdemar II, eager to secure his own claims in Estonia, had sent a Danish army under his vassal, Albert of Nordobingia. The battle was ferocious. Thousands of warriors clashed, and in the chaos the Estonian leader Lembitu was killed. The Estonians fought bravely, but without their leader they lost cohesion. The Crusaders and Danes crushed their forces, securing a major victory. The Estonian uprising was over. Chapter 5, the final years 1219, with the Estonian resistance shattered, the Crusaders and Danes moved quickly to divide the spoils. In 1219, the Danes seized northern Estonia, establishing a stronghold at Tallinn, which would later become the capital of modern Estonia. The Livonian Brothers of the Sword, meanwhile, continued their war against the last holdouts of resistance. In 1224, they finally took the stronghold of Tartu, crushing the final remnants of pagan resistance in southern Estonia. By 1227, the war was over. The Livonian Brothers of the Sword had conquered Livonia and Estonia, completing their brutal mission. The land was now Christian, at least in name. The Livonian War of 1206-1227 was one of the most brutal chapters in the Baltic Crusades. Thousands perished. Entire cultures were nearly wiped out. But despite their defeat, the Baltic pagans never truly surrendered. Many continued to practice their old ways in secret, resisting Christian rule in whatever ways they could. And for the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, well, that is a story for another tea time. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Livonian War, be sure to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments what part of history you want us to explore next. Stay tuned for the next chapter in the Baltic Crusades. Teutonic Knights, Origins and Early Years, 1190s-1210s. Welcome back finally to the Baltic Crusades. This will be a more in-depth video because of the importance of the Teutonic Order, also known as the Order of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem, which was born in the chaos of the Third Crusade. Originally, it wasn't a military order at all. It began as a field hospital set up by German merchants from Bremen and Lübeck to care for sick and wounded pilgrims and crusaders during the Siege of Acre in 1190. They received papal recognition in 1191, and by 1198, under the support of the Holy Roman Emperor and the Church, they transitioned into a full-fledged military order, modeled after the Templars and Hospitallers, but distinctly German in character. Their mission was threefold. 1. Defend the Holy Land. 2. Aid Christian pilgrims. 3. Expand Christendom into pagan territory. Enter King Andrew II of Hungary. By the early 1200s, the Teutonic Knights were looking for a new mission, especially after the Holy Land became increasingly difficult to hold. In 1211, King Andrew II of Hungary invited the order to settle in Burzenland, a frontier region in Transylvania, which bordered the Cuman territories, a nomadic pagan people who raided Christian lands. Andrew's idea was straightforward. He wanted a buffer zone between his kingdom and the dangerous Cumans. The Teutonic Knights were perfect, tough, zealous, disciplined, and German, which meant they weren't tied to Hungarian nobility. The knights quickly got to work. They built stone castles and fortresses, cleared land and developed villages, Christianized the local population, pushed east into Cuman territory. This was essentially a dry run for their later campaigns in Prussia and the Baltic, using stone walls, crossbows, and cavalry charges against highly mobile pagan enemies. But trouble was brewing. The Teutonic Order was ambitious, and that scared the Hungarian nobility. In 1218, the order received a papal bull from Pope Honorius III that put their Transylvanian lands directly under papal authority, not Hungarian. That was a major red flag for King Andrew. By 1225, the experiment ended. Andrew expelled the Teutonic Knights from Hungary, fearing they'd carved out a state within a state. The order burned their castles rather than let them fall into enemy hands and left for good, but not empty-handed. They'd learned 3 key lessons in Transylvania. 1. Don't trust kings. Get direct papal backing for expansion. 2. Build autonomous, walled, militarized settlements. 3. Push into pagan frontiers with long-term crusading goals. Setting the stage, the Baltic in the S. By the late S, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword were already active in Livonia and Estonia, but the lands west of them, Prussia, Samogitia, and Lithuania, remained deeply pagan and fiercely independent. Conrad I of Masovia, a Polish duke, was under constant threat from old Prussian raids across his eastern border. His lands were vulnerable, sparsely populated, and underdeveloped. He needed military help, but not just any army. He needed a disciplined force with no local loyalties, no political ambitions in Poland, and full support from the Church. In 1226, Conrad turned to the Teutonic Knights, who had just recently been expelled from Hungary after their Transylvanian campaign. He offered them land in Chelmno-Kulmerland in exchange for defending the frontier and converting the pagan Prussians. But the Knights had learned their lesson in Hungary. They wouldn't come without guarantees. So that same year, they secured one of the most important documents in their history, the Golden Bull of Rimini 1226. Issued by Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, this decree granted the Teutonic Order sovereign rights over any lands they conquered in Prussia. They would rule them not as vassals of the Polish Duke, but as independent lords under imperial and papal protection. This was crucial. The order wasn't just coming to fight, they were coming to build a theocratic crusader state. The forests are thick, the rivers are frozen, smoke curls up from scattered wooden hamlets. This is the frontier, remote, underdeveloped, and dangerous. The Teutonic Knights did not arrive into a well-established town or fortress. What they found instead was wilderness and ruin, a borderland plagued by constant Prussian raids, burned villages, scattered settlements, and frightened locals. Where exactly did they arrive? They landed in a region known as Chelmno-land, or Kulmerland in German. This was a strip of land located between the Vistula and Drwecka rivers, roughly in modern-day north-central Poland. The area had once been part of Christian Poland, but was depopulated and devastated by decades of old Prussian incursions. Think of it as a no-man's land, not quite pagan, not quite Christian. It was sparsely inhabited by Slavic Christians who were too weak to resist invasions and too scattered to form a real defense. In other words, It was perfect for what the Teutonic Knights were looking for. A frontier zone they could fortify, control, and expand from without needing to answer to local lords or share power. How did they establish themselves? 1. Fortifying Chelmno. The first thing the order did was build stone castles, most notably at Thorn Torin and Culm, modern-day Chelmno. These became anchor points for further expansion and colonization. Castles were built in the classic Teutonic style, massive square stone fortresses with high towers, central chapels, and thick defensive walls. From these bases, they launched raids, protected settlers, and imposed order. 2. Importing settlers and craftsmen. The order encouraged German settlers, farmers, craftsmen, merchants to move into the region, offering them land, security, and religious favor. Entire villages were constructed from scratch. Roads were cleared, churches were founded. The Teutonic state was already beginning to take shape, not just as a military outpost, but a full-fledged colonial project. 3. Military organization. The Knights organized a disciplined force, including full Teutonic brothers, elite warrior monks, serving brothers, non-combatant clergy and administrators, mercenaries and loyal laymen. This gave them a flexible, well-supplied army capable of launching quick raids and defending fixed positions. What was the local response? The old Prussians, fierce and tribal, were not centralized, but they were proud and intimately familiar with the forests and marshes. At first, they were caught off guard by the sudden militarization of Chelmno. The Teutonic Order's harsh reprisals, burning villages, forced conversions, executions of pagan priests, were meant to terrorize and destabilize. But resistance hardened quickly, setting the stage for nearly 50 years of war. Why this moment matters. The arrival in 1228 wasn't just the beginning of the Teutonic Order's time in Prussia. It was the beginning of something entirely new, a state-building crusade, a vision of total war for the soul of Europe, a multi-decade campaign of conquest, colonization, and theocratic rule unlike anything in the Latin West. Please like, subscribe, and follow along. Join us next time two powerfully military orders meet, the Teutonic Order and the Livonian Brothers of the Sword. And be on the lookout for my video on the Sixth Crusade, back in the Holy Land. Welcome back to The Historian Translates and Part 3 of my Baltic Crusade series. Part 1 focused on the introduction of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword in modern-day Latvia and Estonia, as well as a small Danish crusader presence in the same regions. Part 2 covered the infamous Teutonic Order's origin, their Transylvanian campaigns and introduction into Prussia with the backing of the Pope and Holy Roman Emperor. They had begun to make a name for themselves due to their successful Transylvanian campaigns. These are two very different orders. The Sword Brothers are effective killers and conquerors, but had no patience for diplomacy or proper conversion. They were also less controlled, more isolated, and acted more independently, whereas the Teutonic Knights had the favor of the Emperor and Pope and had been asked to come to the region by a Polish duke. The Teutonic Knights were effective killers as well, but they were also builders, settlers, and pioneers. They brought with them German folks to live on the land. They built large stone castles, cleared trees for roads, and even practiced diplomacy with some of the pagan tribes. Today, our two powerful military orders' oaths would converge. The Sword Brothers' activities leading up to 1228, the 1200s, 1220s. 1. Brutal campaigns in Livonia and southern Estonia, 1202-1217. The Sword Brothers aggressively subjugated the Livs and Latgalians, building castles and forcing mass baptisms. Their primary base was Riga, fortified and turned into a religious and military hub. They clashed often with rebellious locals and fought pitched battles to suppress uprisings. They worked with German merchants, settlers, and missionaries, creating a colonial structure. 2. The Estonian campaigns and uprising of 1217. In the 1210s, they pushed north into Estonia. Initial victories were followed by brutal guerrilla resistance. In 1217, Estonians launched a massive uprising, nearly driving the Germans out. The Sword Brothers fought the Battle of St. Matthew's Day, where Bishop Albert's forces were ambushed and his brother killed. 3. The Danish factor, 1219-1227. King Valdemar II of Denmark landed in northern Estonia in 1219, clashing with the Sword Brothers over control of the region. The Danes founded Revel Tallinn, establishing dominance in the north. This led to uneasy coexistence and territorial division, though competition remained fierce. 4. The Crusader victory and expansion 1220s. By the early 1220s, the Sword Brothers had regained momentum, built more castles, subjugated southern Estonia and Livonia more firmly, converted or killed many pagan leaders. They had essentially become military governors, lording over native populations with the backing of the church. 1228, status of the order. By 1228, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword were overextended from constant warfare and castle building, ruling large parts of Livonia and southern Estonia, but facing resistance from the Lithuanians to the south, the Semigallians and Curonians, local Baltic tribes, growing in arrogance and ambition, acting like independent warlords, often ignoring papal and bishopric authority. It's the early 13th century. The icy winds of the Baltic sweep across the forests and marshlands of Estonia. Two crusading powers, both champions of Christendom, find themselves not as allies, but as rivals. Clash of Crosses, the Sword Brothers versus the Danes, 1219-1227. In 1219, King Valdemar II of Denmark launched a powerful expedition into northern Estonia, answering Pope Honorius III's call to bring Christianity to the Baltic. The Danes landed at Lindenæs, near modern-day Tallinn, and built a stronghold. The Sword Brothers, based further south in Riga, had been fighting a bitter war of attrition against the Livs and Estonians since 1202. But the Danes' sudden arrival raised alarm bells. Not only did they plant the Danish flag in Estonia, but they claimed exclusive rights over the region. Despite both orders technically fighting in the name of the church, cooperation was not their strong suit. The Sword Brothers saw themselves as the true frontier warriors, having bled for 2 decades in Livonia and Estonia. The Danes, with their royal funding and sudden land grabs, were seen as interlopers. Tensions boil over. The Sword Brothers refused to recognize Danish authority in northern Estonia. They saw the Danish claims as a threat to their hard-won autonomy. And the Danes? They viewed the Sword Brothers as reckless military monks, too wild, too aggressive, and too eager to establish their own state. There are no full-scale battles recorded between the two, but skirmishes and sabotage were common. Raids on each other's supply routes, disputes over tribute from pagan villages, churchmen caught in the middle, trying to mediate but failing. In 1225, Pope Honorius III tried to resolve the tensions by dividing Estonia. Northern Estonia, Reval Tallinn, would remain under Danish control. Southern Estonia and Livonia would be governed by the Sword Brothers and the bishopric of Riga. But neither side was satisfied. The breaking point, 1227. In 1227, during a period of Danish weakness, after King Valdemar was captured by German pirates and held for ransom, the Sword Brothers made their move. They invaded northern Estonia, seized Danish castles, and wiped out Danish presence in the region. Reval fell, and the Sword Brothers proclaimed full control over Estonia. It was the first time one crusading order attacked and displaced another in the Baltic. The Danes wouldn't return to power in Estonia for decades. What began as a holy war had become a cold war of competing crusaders, and it would not be the last time Christendom fractured from within. In 1227, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword stood victorious. Their Crimson Cross banners flew over every major fortress from Riga to Reval. For the first time, all of Estonia was under the sword, and the sword alone. 1227-1230, the height of power. Fresh off their conquest of northern Estonia, the brothers believed they had achieved what no crusading force had done before, total domination of Livonia and Estonia. The Danes were expelled, the Bishop of Riga sidelined, and the papal envoys ignored. They ruled like warrior kings, built castles, demanded tribute, and extracted tithes from newly Christianized peasants. Baptisms were often symbolic, forced upon terrified Estonian villagers after bloody battles. Local uprisings in Livonia, Latgale, and southern Estonia were met with ruthless crackdowns. But there were cracks beneath the surface, cracks in the order. 1. Isolation from the papacy. The order had grown increasingly independent, refusing to submit fully to either the Archbishop of Riga or Rome. They acted as secular rulers, which drew criticism from Pope Gregory IX. Exhaustion. Years of constant warfare, castle building, and failed harvests had drained their resources. The Crusader states they governed were poor and unstable. 3. New enemies, Lithuania and Samogitia. To the south and west, pagan Lithuania and Samogitia remained defiant. Unlike the Livs or Estonians, the Lithuanians were unified, experienced warriors, with the ability to launch devastating raids deep into Livonia. The Sword Brothers underestimated their new foe. 1230-1235, expanding too far, too fast. Rather than consolidate power, the order pushed into Semigallia and Kurland, hoping to establish a frontier buffer. New castles were built, stretching their manpower thin. They launched raids into Lithuanian territory, drawing fierce retaliation. Meanwhile, Pope Gregory IX became increasingly wary of the Sword Brothers' behavior. A papal plan to bring in the Teutonic Order as a reform-minded ally began to take shape, but the Sword Brothers were too proud to ask for help. And then came the disaster. 1236, the Battle of Saule, the day the swords broke. In September 1236, the master of the order, Volkwin, led a large force southward into Samogitia, modern western Lithuania, but they were ambushed near the town of Saule by a coalition of Samogitian and Semigallian warriors. It was a bloodbath. Volkwin and almost the entire knightly leadership were killed. Many crusaders drowned fleeing into nearby swamps. Survivors were hunted down and executed by pagan warriors as sacrifices to their gods. The defeat shattered the order's military capacity. The dream of a Livonian crusader kingdom was collapsing. Narrator voice fade out. From prideful victors to humbled vassals, the Livonian Sword Brothers were forged in blood and broken in arrogance. But their story was far from over. Under the Black Cross of the Teutonic Order, a new war for the soul of the Baltic had just begun. 1230, the Teutonic Knights received a far more ambitious invitation from Duke Conrad I of Masovia in northern Poland. Conrad's duchy was plagued by constant raids from the pagan Prussians to the north. Fierce tribes who worshipped forest gods, practiced human sacrifice, and burned Christian missions to the ground. Conrad had tried everything: local crusades, fort construction, papal help. Nothing worked. So he turned to the Teutonic Order. In the Treaty of Cruswica, Conrad granted the order Chelmno land, Kalmarland, on the condition that they would defend Masovia, conquer and Christianize Prussia. Crucially, the Teutonic Knights ensured they had direct papal approval via a forged or misunderstood document sometimes referred to as the Golden Bull of Rieti 1234, supposedly granting them sovereignty over conquered lands, not just feudal tenure under Polish dukes. This was a game changer. 1230-1237, the Prussian campaign begins. Armed with papal blessing, German recruits, and a clear purpose, the Teutonic Knights crossed the Vistula and began constructing fortresses along the frontier. Thorn-Toran, Kulmkomno, Elbing. They brought not only warriors, but settlers, priests, farmers, engineers, and German colonists who created a network of Christianized villages behind the military lines. Their approach was methodical. Offer terms to Prussian chieftains, force baptism through conquest, build a castle, then repeat. But the Prussians were fierce and unrelenting. Their forest warfare was brutal, and many castles were isolated and vulnerable. Nonetheless, by 1236, the Teutonic Order had gained a foothold in Prussia. Diplomacy, power, and expansion. During this decade, the Teutonic Order also received strong support from Pope Gregory IX, was favored by Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who granted them privileges, became increasingly involved in diplomatic intrigue between Poland, the papacy, and the empire. They were no longer just crusaders. They were becoming a sovereign military state with its own agenda. 1237, paths converge. After the Battle of Saule in 1236, the Sword Brothers were nearly destroyed, recognizing the threat to Christian holdings in Livonia and Estonia. Pope Gregory IX ordered that the remnants of the Sword Brothers be incorporated into the Teutonic Order. In 1237, the Teutonic Order formally absorbed them, creating an autonomous branch known as the Livonian Order, with Riga as its center. In 1237, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword officially ceased to exist. They became the Livonian branch of the Teutonic Knights, maintaining some autonomy but answering to the Grand Master in Prussia. This doubled the Teutonic Order's presence in the Baltic overnight. They now controlled Livonia and Estonia via the Livonian Order. Prussia, via their own expansion, had influence in Poland and ties to the empire. In less than a decade, the Teutonic Order transformed from exiled landless knights to the most powerful crusading force in Europe's northern frontier. With the Sword Brothers now wearing the Black Cross, the Baltic would never be the same. Welcome back to The Historian Translates in Part 4 of my Baltic Crusades series. In our last video, we covered the Teutonic Knights' successes and control of Prussia, the vicious battles of the Livonian Sword Brothers in modern-day Latvia and Estonia, and the eventual hubris and overstretching of resources that led to their downfall and the merger of the Livonian Sword Brothers with the Teutonic Order. The Teutons had the full backing of the Pope, a civilization-building approach to Germanize the lands they conquered, and were masters of diplomacy. They were able to smooth over relations with the Danish Crusaders and had the manpower to take over the missions in Estonia and Latvia. The Sword Brothers' time in the limelight may have come to the end, but the Teutonic Order has taken over, and their time is just beginning. 1237. The Baltic frontier is cold, ruthless, and ablaze with ambition. After the merger. Following their disastrous defeat at the Battle of Saul in 1236, the remnants of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword were absorbed into the Teutonic Order by papal decree. This wasn't just a reshuffling of military assets, it was a seismic shift in power. The Teutonic Knights now controlled not only their Prussian strongholds to the south, but also Livonia to the north, with the city of Riga as a crucial base. The order was now unified under a single rule, with military discipline, papal backing, and strategic infrastructure. Their new goal, total domination of the Eastern Baltic. And to do that, they would need to crush not only the pagan resistance, but also rival Christian kingdoms and Orthodox principalities. Subjugation of the Baltic tribes. Between 1237 and 1240, the Teutonic Knights pursued a brutal policy of scorched earth conversion. Prussian resistance was crushed, and Baltic tribes like the Semigallians and Salonians were either baptized or butchered. They constructed castles and roads, fortifying their hold and making rapid strikes into resistant regions. But they were ambitious beyond the pagans. They had their eyes on Russian Orthodox territory. Eyes on Novgorod. In 1239, the order turned east. Their gaze fell upon Pskov and Novgorod, rich Orthodox cities with deep cultural roots and proud independence. These were not pagans, but Christians, Eastern Christians. To the Teutonic Order, this was a theological gray area. Pope Gregory IX had hinted that Orthodox Christians needed reform, and where theology faltered, steel often followed. Pskov fell quickly, betrayed by pro-Catholic nobles. Novgorod, however, would be different. Its prince, Alexander Nevsky, had been watching. Orthodox resistance rises. By 1240, Alexander had already earned his title, Nevsky, after repelling a Swedish invasion at the Battle of the Neva. He now turned his full attention to the German threat. He expelled Catholic priests, rallied the boyars, and summoned warriors from across the Rus. The Teutonic Knights, emboldened by success, built a fort at Izborsk and advanced into Russian land like they had with the pagans. But this was a dangerous miscalculation. Winter preparations. As winter descended in 1241, both sides began preparing for a clash that neither could avoid. The Teutonic Order, used to campaigning in the harsh Baltic terrain, fortified positions and sent raiding parties deeper into Russian territory. Alexander Nevsky, meanwhile, was organizing a winter campaign. He would not wait, he would strike. And in 1242, on a frozen lake, steel would meet ice, and history would be forged. It is April 1242. The icy surface of Lake Peipus stretches endlessly. On one side, rows of disciplined Teutonic Knights stand ready, cloaked in white surcoats, emblazoned with stark black crosses. On the other, Russian warriors under the command of Prince Alexander Nevsky, hardened from war, fur-draped, their spears glinting in the early light. The knights, Reinforced by Danish crusaders and Baltic auxiliaries, planned to lure the Russian army into open combat. Their heavy cavalry was unmatched in a direct charge, but they underestimated the terrain and Nevsky's strategy. Nevsky understood the land. He chose the frozen Lake Peipus for his stand, not merely for its openness, but for the treacherous ice beneath. The battle begins. Like a storm, the German knights thunder forward, lances lowered, a wall of steel and righteousness. But Nevsky's men wait, unmoving, until the last second. The Russian wings envelop the flanks. Archers rain arrows from the tree line. As the Teutonic knights slam into the center, the ice begins to groan under the immense weight. Turning point, the ice breaks. The frozen lake proves deadly. The heavy armor of the knights becomes a curse. Many drown as the Russian counterattack intensifies. The Germans try to retreat, but it's chaos. Nevsky presses the advantage, his forces unrelenting. The battle was a catastrophic loss for the Teutonic Order. Nevsky's victory became a symbol of orthodox resistance against Western intrusion. It preserved Novgorod's independence and halted Catholic crusading ambitions in Russia, at least for a time. This was no ordinary battlefield. This was ice. This was legend. Despite their crushing defeat at Lake Peipus, the Teutonic Order was far from destroyed. The battle was a devastating blow to their ambitions in Russia, but it did not break their overall power. Here's what happened next. For more on Alexander Nevsky, the Russian hero of the battle, check out my Battle of the Ice video. Or for more on the origins of Kievan Rus and the Christian Orthodoxy faith, check out my Russian history playlist. Aftermath of the battle on the ice. Strategic withdrawal from Russia. The Teutonic Order recognized that further incursions into Novgorod or Pskov would be both costly and likely futile. Alexander Nevsky had shown both military and diplomatic skill. Any future campaigns risked more political fallout and more frozen graves. So yes, they left Russia alone, effectively drawing a line at the eastern frontier. Refocusing their efforts, rather than expand eastward, the order turned its energy back to Prussia and the Baltic territories, where pagan Lithuanian and Samogitian tribes remained unconquered. These tribes would become the order's primary targets for the next century. Strength in the West. Back in the Holy Roman Empire and across Europe, the Teutonic Order maintained prestige. They were still regarded as one of the great monastic military orders alongside the Templars and Hospitallers. They received funding, noble recruits, and papal support to continue their holy mission in the Baltic. Fortification and colonization. They fortified their control over conquered lands by building stone castles, establishing German settlements, and working closely with merchants, nobles, and bishops to create a lasting state infrastructure. Tune in next time for our Baltic Crusades Part 5 starting in 1243, and be on the lookout for the history of the Crusades Part 11 covering the 7th Crusade. As always, like and subscribe for more content. Welcome back to the Historian Translated in Part 5 of the Baltic Crusades. We last left off with the Teutonic Knights decimating pagan tribes after their merger with the Livonian Sword Brothers. Despite a famous loss in Novgorod, they were conquering Eastern Europe through force quite well. By the mid-13th century, the Northern Crusades had reached a fever pitch. The Teutonic Order, warrior monks wrapped in black cloaks and bound by iron discipline, marched deeper into pagan territory. From their castles in Königsberg, Elbing, and Torun, they expanded eastward and northward, determined to baptize the last holdouts of European paganism in blood or water. From 1244 to 1260, the Teutonic Knights entrenched themselves across the Prussian frontier. They built stone fortresses, invited German settlers, and imposed a new Christian order. Pagan tribes such as the Warmians, Bartians, Natangians, and Sambians were subjugated through decades of grinding warfare and relentless missionary pressure. The order didn't just wage war, they governed. Bishops, settlers, and knights all worked in tandem, constructing roads, churches, and castles, imposing Germanic law and Catholic ritual upon native populations. But resistance simmered. Though many Prussians had been baptized, their conversions were often shallow. Local chiefs resented foreign rule. Priests lived under constant threat. Crusader garrisons were frequently isolated and outnumbered. The conquered land seethed beneath the surface. And then, the storm broke. At Derbe, the Teutonic Order suffered a humiliating defeat. A combined force of knights from Livonia and Prussia was annihilated by Samogitian warriors. Even the Christianized Curonians turned on their former allies. More than 150 knights died. Among the dead were many of the Order's elite. It was one of the worst losses in their history. The defeat at Derbe ignited a fire across the Baltic. The Prussian tribes rose in unison. The Natangians, Bartians, Sambians, and Sudovians cast off the Christian yoke. The Great Prussian Uprising had begun. From 1260 to 1274, the uprising became an existential war. Dozens of castles fell. Missionaries were executed. Pagan shrines were rebuilt in secret. The forest reclaimed the land. For the first time in decades, the Teutonic Order was truly on the defensive. The Prussian insurgents, expert in guerrilla warfare, ambushed supply lines, poisoned wells, and laid traps in swamps and forests. Crusaders, weighed down by heavy mail, were no match for fast-moving raiders. Realizing the gravity of the threat, the Order appealed to the Pope and Holy Roman Empire for aid. New crusading bulls were issued. Reinforcements arrived from the Rhineland and Bohemia. A war of annihilation began. The Order fought back with unmatched cruelty. Entire villages were burned. Pagans who surrendered were enslaved. Some were resettled in distant lands, their cultures erased. It was a war not just of conquest, but of extermination. By 1274, after nearly 14 years of bloodshed, the uprising was crushed. Prussian culture would never fully recover, but the Teutonic victory came at a cost. Their numbers were thinned, their castles weakened, and worse still, beyond the forest of Samogitia, a new enemy stirred, Lithuania. Though they survived the Great Uprising, the Teutonic Knights had made new enemies, and their greatest war was yet to come. In the aftermath of the brutal Prussian uprising, the Teutonic Order shifted its gaze to the last major pagan holdout in Europe, Lithuania. It was a land of dense forests, swift rivers, and unconquered warriors. The Lithuanian Wars would define the next century of conflict in the north. By the late 1272s and early 1282s, the Teutonic Knights had secured much of Prussia. Their next step was to push eastward, establishing Krismemel, modern-day Klaipėda, as a fortress against the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. But the Lithuanians were no passive foe. Grand Duke Traidenis led raids deep into Prussian territory, using speed and knowledge of the terrain to strike hard and vanish into the woods. To strike back, the Order launched brutal campaigns into Samogitia, the key region between Prussia and Livonia. Yet the Samogitians were ferocious defenders, using ambushes and hit-and-run tactics. They made the knightly conquests slow and costly. At Medininkai, the knights suffered one of their first serious setbacks. A combined force of Lithuanians and Samogitians decimated a Teutonic detachment, killing nearly every knight involved. The Order adapted. They built more fortresses along the Niemen River, using stone, timber, and German settlers to create a frontier belt of Christianity and military power. From here, they could launch raids, enforce tribute, and impose control over trade routes. By the 1292s, a new power emerged in Lithuania, Vytautas. A pragmatic and fierce leader, he forged alliances with enemies of the Order, including Riga itself. In 1298, a stunning reversal occurred. Vytautas, aided by rebel factions within Riga, crushed the Livonian branch of the Order at Taurida. Their landmaster Bruno was slain, and the Order's prestige took a serious blow. The response? Another crusade. The Pope reissued the call against the pagans, drawing in German nobles, knights from Bohemia, and even Scandinavian volunteers. But even so, the Order now realized this wouldn't be a brief war. It would be a generational struggle. And so, the Lithuanian Wars had begun. The opening campaigns showed what was to come: high casualties, fluid alliances, and no mercy. Welcome back to the Baltic Crusades Part 6, the Lithuanian Wars and the Rise of a Dynasty. It is the early 1292s. The Teutonic Order, having merged with the remnants of the Sword Brothers, stands poised for further conquest. Their castles, Marienburg, Königsberg, and Kreisberg, form a steel ring around pagan Prussia and beyond. But one land resists them still, Lithuania. Vytautas, the son of a Lithuanian duke, emerges as the next great leader. He is clever, ruthless, and fiercely committed to keeping Lithuania free of foreign domination. Under his leadership, the Lithuanians begin to adopt more centralized authority and refine their military tactics. Vytautas strikes hard. He raids Teutonic outposts and even launches attacks on the newly Christianized cities of Prussia. Pagan fervor is joined with a new pragmatism. Vytautas allies with the Orthodox Ruthenians and, ironically, with Polish cities hostile to the order. The Teutonic response is brutal. Between 1290 and 1310, they launched dozens of campaigns into Samogitia, Oxtytija, and beyond. Castles are built, villages are burned, but Lithuania's guerrilla tactics, ambushes, feigned retreats, and use of the dense forests proved difficult to counter. Despite victories on both sides, the conflict reaches a stalemate. Vytautas even captures Riga for a time, installing a Lithuanian garrison in the heart of Livonia. But the order regroups. When Vytautas dies, many fear Lithuania's resistance will collapse. But they are wrong. His brother Gediminas is even more formidable. A shrewd diplomat, an ambitious warlord, Gediminas knows that Lithuania cannot win by brute force alone. So he writes letters to the Pope, to the Holy Roman Emperor, offering to convert. If certain terms are met, it is a brilliant gambit. Gediminas stalls the Teutonic campaigns, buys time, and reinforces Lithuania's borders. At the same time, he strengthens alliances with Slavic principalities, building a buffer against Crusader incursions. But peace never lasts long. The Teutonic Order grows more powerful, drawing knights from across Europe. The Prussian and Livonian castles become launching pads for endless campaigns. And so, by the mid-1320s, the Lithuanian wars enter a new chapter, one that will see battles of greater scale, alliances of shifting loyalty, and the blood of thousands spilled across frozen rivers and forested glades. This is not just a war of swords and spears, it is a war of survival. And as the Teutonic Knights continued their crusade against the last bastions of paganism in Europe, they met a new and formidable adversary, one who would become a legend in the Baltic world. His name was Algirdas, a shifting power, the rise of a dynasty. Algirdas was born around 1296, the son of Grand Duke Gediminas of Lithuania. The Gediminid dynasty had brought stability and expansion to the pagan state, resisting both German and Polish encroachment. The dynasty gave birth to an unprecedented amount of competent warriors and leaders, each one taking over where his father, brother, or uncle left off. But upon Gediminas's death in 1341, a succession crisis ensued. His son Jaunutis was appointed Grand Duke, but his reign was weak, indecisive. The pagan nobles grumbled. The land suffered Teutonic raids. Algirdas and his brother Kęstutis, both seasoned warriors and shrewd politicians, took action. By 1345, the two staged a bloodless coup, deposing Jaunutis and establishing joint rule, with Algirdas as Grand Duke based in Vilnius, and Kęstutis controlling the western front in Trakai, directly defending against the Teutonic Knights. This partnership would define Lithuanian resistance for a generation. While Kęstutis handled the western defense, Algirdas turned his eyes east. His strategy was brilliant: avoid direct confrontation with the heavily militarized Crusader order, and instead expand Lithuanian influence over the Russian principalities, particularly the divided and weakened cities of Smolensk, Bryansk, and even Kiev. The Russians were not as strong as Novgorod had been a century earlier as they repelled the Teutonic Knights. Apart from Novgorod, all major municipalities had been ravaged by the Mongols in the 1242s, and the Mongols remained overlords into the 15th century, forcing cities to pay tribute to them. From 1345 to 1360, Algirdas led relentless campaigns, conquering and vassalizing Slavic lands. By exploiting rivalries between Orthodox princes and the disarray left by Mongol overlords, Algirdas carved out an empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. He cleverly maintained paganism at home while allowing orthodoxy in the east, thus preventing rebellion. war on two fronts, the Teutonic threat. Yet while Algirdas fought in the east, the Teutonic Knights launched devastating raids into Samogitia, the ethnically and culturally distinct region of western Lithuania. From 1345 to 1360, Lithuania was engaged in what felt like a two-front war, one against the Catholic Crusaders and the other against rival Slavic lords. But Algirdas, with Kęstutis at his side, never allowed the kingdom to collapse. In fact, he began to counterattack. In 1348, a major battle occurred at Strava River, where the Teutonic Knights achieved a bloody victory over the Lithuanians, killing thousands and capturing many. Kęstutis narrowly escaped with his life, but this defeat hardened Lithuanian resolve. In the 1350 seconds, Algirdas orchestrated a brilliant strategy: temporary truces with the Teutonic Order to free up troops for his eastern ambitions, and then swift betrayals once he had regrouped. A deadly feint, marching on Moscow. Algirdas's most daring move came in 1368, 1370, and 1372, three separate expeditions against the Grand Duchy of Moscow. These weren't mere raids, they were symbolic displays of Lithuania's rise and Russia's vulnerability. In 1370, Algirdas laid siege to Moscow itself. Although he failed to take the Kremlin, he burned the surrounding suburbs, spreading panic and demonstrating that the pagan Grand Duke could stand toe-to-toe with Christendom's great powers. These campaigns served two purposes: to subdue Orthodox rivals and to show the Teutonic Knights that Lithuania was no mere frontier state. By the time of Algirdas's death in 1377, Lithuania had become the largest state in Europe, an empire that defied Crusader domination, coexisted with orthodoxy, and remained defiantly pagan. As great as Algirdas's reign was, and as great as his entire family's reign was for the previous 100 years, his son would become the most famous of them all. But it was Algirdas who secured the borders, repelled the knights, and forged the empire that would dominate Eastern Europe for decades. Algirdas never took the cross, but he wielded the sword, and with that sword he carved a homeland from the jaws of crusade and conquest. The Crusaders had met their match not in religion but in resilience. Next up, Jogaila, the Christian prince. The cross meets the crown. Welcome back to the Baltic Crusades Part 7. In the twilight of the 14th century, the Northern Crusades entered a new phase. The pagan Grand Duchy of Lithuania stood as the final holdout in a Europe increasingly dominated by cross and crown. But with the death of a powerful ruler in 1377, the fate of the Baltic world would soon rest in the hands of one man, a prince named Jogaila. Kinch's story is one of faith and fire, of betrayal and diplomacy, of civil war and empire. And it would end with one of the greatest military clashes of the medieval world, the Battle of Grunwald. The death of Algirdas and Jogaila's inheritance minus 1377. In 1377, Grand Duke Algirdas of Lithuania died after ruling for over 3 decades. He had presided over a vast and multicultural realm, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. His death, however, did not bring peace. It brought uncertainty. Algirdas had ruled jointly with his brother Kęstutis, who focused on defending the western frontier from the Teutonic Knights. Upon Algirdas's death, Jogaila, his son by his second wife Uliana of Tver, became Grand Duke of Lithuania. And this succession would not go unchallenged, Jogaila's dynastic bloodline minus the Gediminid legacy. But Jogaila was not just the son of a Grand Duke, he was the heir of one of the most influential dynasties in Eastern Europe. Gediminid lineage minus explained for viewers when Gediminas, founder of the dynasty, expanded Lithuania into a multi-ethnic empire. Algirdas, Gediminas's son, married twice, most relevantly to Uliana of Tver, a Ruthenian Orthodox princess, Jogaila, son of Algirdas and Uliana, raised in a court shaped by both pagan traditions and Orthodox influences. Jogaila's bloodline gave him legitimacy, but it also created fractures. Lithuania was not a unified nation. It was a coalition of pagan Lithuanians, Orthodox Ruthenians, and ambitious nobles, and some of them did not trust a young ruler with divided loyalties. The Teutonic threat remains, Meanwhile, on Lithuania's western frontier, the Teutonic Order remained a deadly threat. Though the order had suffered setbacks, it continued to wage religious war against the pagan Lithuanians, seeking not just conversion, but conquest. Despite prior defeats, the Teutonic Knights were still militarily strong, politically connected, and ideologically driven. They viewed Jogailah's rise as a strategic opportunity to exploit internal divisions. Tensions rise within Lithuania minus seeds of civil war. In the background, a storm was brewing. Jogailah's uncle, Kęstutis, had spent decades defending Lithuania's western borders and expected continued power after Algirdas's death. But the young Jogailah had different ideas. And Jogailah made independent diplomatic moves, notably negotiating a secret truce with the Teutonic Knights in 1379.
And Kęstutis saw this as a betrayal of Lithuania's struggle.
So what began as a fragile co-rule would soon erupt into a bitter civil war. Uncle would face nephew, and the fate of Lithuania would hang in the balance. A throne would be seized, a prison cell would seal a legacy, and from the ashes of betrayal a new alliance would reshape Europe, civil war in Lithuania minus nephew versus uncle. By the early 1382s, Lithuania stood on a knife's edge. With the death of Grand Duke Algirdas, his son Jogailah had inherited the crown, but not without challenge. His uncle, the seasoned warlord Kęstutis, believed he had a rightful claim to power. Now kin would rise against kin, and Lithuania, the last pagan stronghold in Europe, would be torn apart from within. A kingdom divided minus Kęstutis strikes back. In 1381, Kęstutis discovered a dangerous secret. Jogailah, his own nephew, had negotiated a private truce with the Teutonic Knights without his knowledge. To Kęstutis, this was treason, not just against him, but against Lithuania's sacred fight for survival. In Kęstutis marched on Vilnius, the capital. And Jogailah was overthrown, briefly. In Kęstutis crowned himself Grand Duke of Lithuania, forcing Jogailah into submission. Jogailah's countermove minus a ruthless return. But Jogailah was not finished. Within a year he rallied his supporters, including many powerful nobles from the Ruthenian lands, and staged a counter-coup. When Jogailah retook Vilnius in 1382, and Kęstutis and his son Vytautas were captured and imprisoned at Kriva Castle, shortly after Kęstutis was found dead in prison, officially suicide. But many believe he was murdered, on Jogailah's orders. The rise of Vytautas minus escape and alliance with the enemy. And now the stage shifted. Kęstutis was dead, but his son Vytautas, the future Vytautas the Great, would not forgive. He escaped captivity and did the unthinkable. He fled to the Teutonic Order. Vytautas took refuge in Prussia, and in 1384 he converted to Christianity under Teutonic sponsorship. In return, the Teutonic Knights supported Vytautas militarily, hoping to place him on the Lithuanian throne as a puppet. A temporary truce, minus Jogailah and Vytautas, reconcile. But Vytautas was no one's puppet. In 1384, seeing that the Teutonic Order sought to dominate Lithuania, he broke ties with them and returned to Jogailah. The two cousins reconciled. For now, Vytautas was given lands in Samogitia and a measure of autonomy, and Jogailah secured his rule over Lithuania, but greater ambitions loomed. And the west, the Teutonic Knights watched with rage. Their efforts to conquer Lithuania through force had failed, and now their last great hope, Vytautas, had returned to his cousin's side. But they would not forget, and neither would Vytautas. In the next chapter, Jogailah's destiny will reach beyond Lithuania. A Polish queen awaits, a new crown will be offered, but the cost will be nothing less than the soul of a pagan kingdom, the union of Kriwo and the baptism of a nation. In the ashes of civil war, the Grand Duke of Lithuania faced a choice. Surrounded by enemies and under pressure from every side, Jogailah could resist or transform. What followed would change the course of Eastern European history. Tennis is the story of the union of Kriwo, of the last pagan kingdom in Europe embracing Christianity, not by force of conquest, but by marriage, diplomacy, and ambition. Poland seeks a partner minus the proposal of 1,385. By the mid-1380s, Poland stood at a crossroads. Its young queen, Jadwiga of Anjou, had been crowned King of Poland at the age of 11 to secure her royal authority. But the kingdom needed a strong partner, militarily, politically, and dynastically, and Jadwiga was betrothed to a Habsburg prince, but many Polish nobles opposed this. They turned instead to Jogaila, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, narrator Fifo, and ruled a vast empire, but remained a pagan in a Christian world. The offer was simple and world-changing. The Union of Kriwo minus terms and promises. In August 1385, in the castle of Kriwo, Jogaila signed a formal act of union. He promised 3 things in main terms. 1. Marry Queen Jadwiga of Poland. 2. Convert to Roman Catholicism and baptize his nobles and subjects. 3. Unite Lithuania with Poland under a single crown. And Jogaila also renounced Lithuania's pagan faith and pledged loyalty to the Pope, and it was both a religious shift and a political masterstroke. In exchange, Jogaila would not only marry a queen, he would become a king. Baptism and coronation minus Jogaila becomes Władysław II. In early 1386, Jogaila traveled to Kraków. There he was baptized as Władysław, adopting the name of Poland's first historic king. He married Jadwiga, and within days was crowned King Władysław II Jagiello of Poland. With this act, Lithuania became the last European state to formally convert to Christianity, and thousands of nobles were baptized in mass ceremonies in Vilnius and other towns. And the baptism of Lithuania was more than symbolic. It ended centuries of crusade justification for the Teutonic Order. For if the Lithuanians were now Christians, why were the knights still attacking? A fragile union minus problems began immediately. Though the crowns were joined, the kingdoms remained distinct. Lithuania retained its own laws, nobles, and customs, and many of its Orthodox subjects remained skeptical of Catholic rule. Vytautas, still ambitious, watched closely, and many Lithuanian nobles resented Polish influence, and the Teutonic Order claimed the conversion was a sham, continuing its war under new pretenses. The Teutonic Order reacts minus a new enemy. To the Teutonic Order, the Union of Kriwo was an existential threat. Not only was their stated purpose, converting pagans, now obsolete, but a united Poland-Lithuania posed a military and political force they could no longer ignore. The order accused Jogaila of false conversion and began raiding Lithuania again, often under the excuse of protecting the Orthodox population or reclaiming land. A new conflict loomed on the horizon, and Jogaila had traded oak groves for cathedrals, spears for crosses, pagan fire for Christian diplomacy, but peace would not come. And ahead, the rise of Vytautas the Great, the reforging of Lithuania, and the largest battlefield clash of the Middle Ages, Grunwald. Subscribe for the next chapter, The Rise of Vytautas and the Road to War with the Teutonic Order, the Northern Crusades' final chapter, Vytautas the Great and the Road to Grunwald, a crown gained, a kingdom reshaped. But beneath the surface of the Polish-Lithuanian Union, ambitions stirred. One man, once a fugitive, now a contender, would rise again. Vytautas, the son of Kęstutis, would become the most powerful man in Lithuania. But first he would face betrayal, forge alliances, and make war against his own cousin. Vytautas returns, tensions after Kriwo. Though Jogaila now wore a Christian crown, not all Lithuanians bowed to him. Many still followed Vytautas, who, after escaping Teutonic captivity, had returned to his ancestral lands. He played the long game, waiting, watching, and slowly gathering strength. Jogaila's Polish rule meant he governed from Krakow, leaving Lithuania under appointed governors, which angered local nobles. But Vytautas positioned himself as defender of Lithuanian autonomy, especially among Samogitians and Ruthenians. Civil war reignites. Vytautas versus Jogaila. In 1389, tensions broke. Vytautas rebelled against Jogaila once more, this time not to restore paganism, but to restore independence. With support from the Teutonic Order, Vytautas launched attacks on Vilnius, and Jogaila's forces held, but the kingdom was fractured, and rather than risk total collapse, Jogaila offered peace. The Austro Agreement, 1392. When 1392, the two cousins struck a deal. Known as the Treaty of Ostro, it was a masterclass in compromise and ambition. When Vytautas became Grand Duke of Lithuania with de facto independence, while Jogaila retained overlordship as King of Poland. And this restored peace, but planted the seeds of dual leadership. Narrator V.O. Grand Duke, Vytautas turned from civil war to statecraft. His mission: unite, Christianize, and militarize Lithuania, and eventually challenge the order. The rise of Vytautas the Great. Vytautas wasn't just a warrior, he was a reformer. He centralized power, built fortresses, and opened diplomacy with Hungary, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Golden Horde. And Samogitia remained a flashpoint, caught between Lithuania, Poland, and the Teutonic Order. Vytautas continued Christianization efforts, strengthening ties with Catholic Europe. By the early 15th century, Lithuania was no longer a pagan holdout. It was a Christian kingdom with the strength of an empire and a score to settle with the knights who had once imprisoned its future ruler. In 1409, the spark was lit. The Samogitians, backed by Vytautas, rose in rebellion against Teutonic rule. The order retaliated brutally, burning villages, executing rebels, and demanding retribution. And Jogaila and Vytautas sent a joint message: support for the rebels. And the Teutonic Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen declared war. And two crowns stood united for the first time in war. The Polish-Lithuanian alliance, once built through diplomacy and marriage, would now be tested in blood. And the largest battlefield Europe had seen since the days of the Crusades was now set. A crusading order armed with centuries of power and privilege, versus a rising commonwealth forged in fire. Next, the Battle of Grunwald. The Northern Crusades Part X, the Battle of Grunwald, the Fall of the Teutonic Order. July 1410. Two of the most powerful armies in Europe meet on the fields of Grunwald. On one side, the Teutonic Order, wealthy, battle-hardened, backed by the papacy. On the other, a united force of Poles and Lithuanians, led by cousins who once warred against each other. This is the story of how a holy order was broken and how a new era was born. The armies gather, summer 1410, when war began in 1409 with the Samogitian uprising. But both sides knew the real conflict would be decided in the open field. King Ladislaw II Jogaila and Grand Duke Vytautas led a unified army, drawing forces from Poland, Lithuania, Ruthenia, and Czech mercenaries, and Tartars from the Golden Horde. The Teutonic Order, led by Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen, called on, and Crusader knights from across Europe, and German allies, on Bohemian, Silesian, and Western volunteers. And estimates vary, but by July 15, 1410, nearly 60,000 warriors stood ready for battle. It was one of the largest engagements in medieval European history. The battlefield, Grunwald, July 15, 1410. On the plains of Grunwald, wide open, ideal for cavalry. The Teutonic Order believed their superior discipline and heavy knights would carry the day. Jogaila deliberately delayed battle in the morning, allowing his men to rest while the Teutonic forces stood in full armor under the sun. The Lithuanian cavalry, led by Vytautas, launched the first assault. And it was a carefully calculated risk. The Lithuanians surged forward, clashing with the Teutonic flanks, but then they began to fall back. The Lithuanian and in retreat, tactical or real. Historians still debate what happened next. The Lithuanian cavalry appeared to retreat, some say in panic, others say by design. The Teutonic knights pushed forward, believing victory was near. And Jogaila had held his elite Polish reserves back, the Polish counterattack turning the tide. As the Teutonic knights pursued the Lithuanians, they left their center exposed. The Polish heavy cavalry, fresh and disciplined, surged forward. The tide turned dramatically. And Vytautas's Lithuanian units rejoined the fight, attacking the flanks. And now surrounded, the Teutonic Order faced a brutal slaughter. Their lines broke, their leaders fell. And Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen was killed in battle, reportedly surrounded and cut down by Polish knights. The Teutonic field army was annihilated. Aftermath: the the beginning of the end. Despite the scale of the victory, the Polish-Lithuanian forces failed to take the Order's capital at Marienburg, thanks to a swift defense by Heinrich von Plauen. But the damage was done. In Treaty of Thorn, and Poland and Lithuania reclaimed Samogitia. The Teutonic Order was crippled militarily and financially, and its power in the Baltic would never recover. Legacy, a new order in the north. And Battle of Grunwald was more than a military victory. It was a cultural and geopolitical turning point. The Teutonic Order's myth of invincibility was shattered, and the rise of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had truly begun. And Lithuania's sovereignty was preserved, and pagan Lithuania had not only converted, it had conquered, and the union of Poland and Lithuania became the dominant power in Eastern Europe. The crusade in the north ended not in conversion, but in collapse. The cross had met the crown and lost, and Grunwald was not the end, but it was the beginning of the end. The mighty Teutonic Order, once the sword of the church in the north, lay shattered. Their Grand Master was dead, their armies destroyed. But from behind stone walls and iron gates the Order clung to power for a little longer. This is the final act of the Northern Crusades. Treaty of Thorn, a hollow peace. In February 1411, the Treaty of Thorn was signed. It ended the Polish-Lithuanian Teutonic War. But it was not a peace born of reconciliation. It was a truce carved from exhaustion. And Poland and Lithuania regained control of Samogitia to Lithuania, reparations in gold and silver. But in Marienburg, the Order's capital remained intact. The Order's core territories survived, at a steep price. An any Teutonic treasury bled silver. Indemnities forced them into debt, and discontent festered within their own walls. Civil unrest and internal decay, and the prestige of the Order was broken. No longer crusaders, now tax collectors, no longer liberators, now occupiers. The Prussian nobility and burghers resented the Order's dominance. The Knight brothers, foreign and isolated, failed to adapt to evolving power structures. The monastic military state model began to crumble, and a great missionary army had become a relic. The spirit of crusade no longer inflamed Europe. Now, it was local resistance and economic collapse that would finish what Grunwald had started. The Prussian Confederation in the 13 Years' War. In 1454, the people of Prussia, knights, merchants, and nobles, rose against the Teutonic Order. They formed the Prussian Confederation and called for Polish protection. And Polish King Casimir IV Jagiellon, descendant of Jogaila, responded by declaring war on the Order. Thus began the 13 Years' War. Key events: prolonged sieges and battles across Prussia, and the fall of Marienburg to Polish forces, mass desertions of Prussian towns to Poland, Second Treaty of Thorn, the Teutonic Order's death blow. Narrator: Fifth. In 1466, the final nail was driven. The second piece of thorn split the Teutonic state in two. Royal Prussia, including Danzig and Thorn, was annexed directly into the Polish crown. The remainder of the Order's territory became a Polish vassal state. The Grand Master was forced to swear allegiance to the King of Poland. From crusaders to vassals, the Teutonic Knights had become servants of the crown they once vowed to destroy. The end of the Northern Crusades, legacy and transformation, and Teutonic Order would linger on, eventually transforming into the Duchy of Prussia in 1525 under Albert of Brandenburg, a Protestant duke who secularized the Order's remaining lands. The age of Crusades in the Baltic was over. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth would become one of the largest and most influential powers in Europe. And paganism had vanished. So too had the sword-bearing monks who sought to end it. For 300 years, the Northern Crusades reshaped the Baltic. From Danish kings to Livonian brothers, from Prussian uprisings to Lithuanian coronations, the struggle between cross and crescent was never confined to the Holy Land. It was here, in the forests and lakes of the north, that Europe's last great crusade ended.